Okay, this is one of the most important videos in the course because it's absolutely crucial that you memorize the concepts being taught in this video. So pay extra attention and watch this video as many times as you need to nail down these concepts so that when you're out there shooting, they'll come naturally to you. In this video, we're going to be talking about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. The goal of this video is to get you away from shooting in auto and learn how to manually control each one of these things to get the best looking videos possible. So let's dive into talking about what each one of these do and how they can help your videos to get the look that you want. The first thing to know is that each one of these affects the brightness of your image. So if you want your image to be brighter or darker, each one of these has a role in making that happen. Let's start with ISO. ISO affects how bright or how dark your image is. The lower your ISO, the darker your image will be, and the higher your ISO, the brighter your image will be. Now, this comes with a warning because the higher your ISO is, the grainier and noisier your footage will be as well. So you want to keep your ISO as low as it can be if you want to get the best image possible. But lucky for you, you have two other things to help make your image brighter, and we'll talk about those right now. Our second part of the brightness triangle is aperture or f-stop. Aperture does two things. First, it controls how bright your image is, and second, it controls how out of focus you want your background to be, which creates depth in your image. Now, as far as brightness goes, aperture is the opposite of ISO in that the lower your aperture is, the brighter your image is. A lot of people get that confused, so make sure to remember that the lower your aperture or f-stop is, the brighter your image will be. Also, the lower your aperture is, the more out of focus your background will be from your subject. The higher your aperture is, the more everything will be in focus. Personally, I like to shoot at low apertures because I like to separate my subject from the background. I think it creates a lot of beautiful depth and makes the image look more cinematic. So remember that the lower your aperture is, the brighter your image will be, and the more out of focus your background will be. The higher your aperture, the darker your image will be, and the more everything will be in focus. And a helpful tip to know is that if you're shooting into the sun and you want to create a cool starburst like this, shooting at a high aperture will create that. The third part of the brightness triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed also does two things. First, shutter speed is like aperture, where the lower your shutter speed, the brighter your image is. And the higher your shutter speed, the darker your image is. The second thing that shutter speed does is it controls how much motion blur you see in a moving subject. If you have a low shutter speed, there will be more motion blur, and if you have a high shutter speed, you will have a more crisp and sharp subject. Now, the general rule for shutter speed is that for cinematic video, you want your shutter speed to be twice the frame rate that you're shooting at. So the most common frame rates that you'd shoot at are 24 frames a second for normal footage and 60 frames a second for slow motion. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you'd want your shutter speed to be twice your frame rate, so you'd want a 1/48th shutter speed, but most DSLR cameras don't have that option, so the closest one to it is a 1/50th shutter speed. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second in slow motion, you want to have a 1/120th shutter speed because 120 is twice as much as 60, and that's the rule. So in a perfect world, those are the only two shutter speeds that you would use for those two frame rates. Alright, so now that you know what each of these do, let's go through two scenarios here. Scenario 1. You're outside on a bright sunny day and you turn on your camera and your image is way too bright. What do? Well, you have three options on how to make your image darker. The first thing you want to do is turn down your ISO, because you always want your ISO to be as low as you can if you don't want your shot to be grainy and noisy. So let's say you turn down your ISO all the way and it's still too bright. Now what do? Well, now you're left with a couple options. You can either increase your aperture, which will make your image darker, but it will also make your background more in focus, or you can increase your shutter speed, which will also make your image darker, but it will also make your image look too sharp and jittery and not natural, or you could do a bit of both. It all depends on what look you're going for. Another option would be to buy an ND filter, which is basically like putting sunglasses onto your lens, which makes it so that you can stay at a low aperture and stay near your desired shutter speed. Okay, scenario number 2. You're shooting a wedding reception and it's super dark indoors, and when you turn on your camera, you realize that your image is way too dark. What do? Well, you have three options. First, I'd make sure that your aperture is as low as it can be. This makes your image brighter, but it also makes it harder to keep your subject in focus, so keep that in mind. Second, I'd make sure your shutter speed is at 1/50th if you're shooting 24 frames per second, or 1/120th if you're shooting 60 frames per second. If you make your shutter speed any lower, your image will be brighter, but it will also make your subject have more motion blur. You could probably get away with lowering it a little bit, but too much will make your subject look like this, and you definitely don't want that. And your third and final option would be to increase your ISO. Keep in mind that the higher your ISO is, the grainier and noisier your footage will be. A lot of this comes down to which camera you have, because there are some cameras that can have their ISO be a lot higher and they still come out with really clean looking images. Sony cameras, for example, do really well at higher ISOs, but they lack in a few other areas like what we talked about in the what camera to buy video. So whichever camera you do buy, make sure that you run some tests with your camera to see how far you can push your ISO without it looking too noisy or grainy. Now, I beg of you to please watch this as many times as you need to memorize these concepts and know what each one of these things do: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So we're gonna do a little Q&A right now, and I'd say that you should watch this video again and again until you can answer all these questions perfectly. I'm gonna ask you a question, and as soon as I ask the question, go ahead and pause your video, think about it, answer it, and then continue to play, and I'll give you the answer. All right, question number 1. What does increasing your ISO do? Answer: it makes your image brighter, but the higher your ISO is, the more grainy and noisy your image will be. Question number 2. What 2 things does having a low aperture do? Answer: it makes your image brighter and it makes your background more out of focus. Question number 3. What happens when you have a low shutter speed? Answer: your image is brighter, but it also gives your subject more motion blur. And question number 4. What is the general rule of shutter speed? Answer: you always want your shutter speed to be twice your frame rate. All right, guys, if you answered all those questions right, you've got it down. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.